Hello, and welcome to our first lecture on state violence and world politics, critical perspectives on war, where we're going to tackle a question of what war is. And then the next lecture will be on war and technology. So I'm just going to share the slides, and a reminder that you can also access all these slides on Moodle, but it might be helpful if you want to listen to this and look at them at the same time. Good. So hopefully you can see the first slide, state violence in world politics. Here is what we're going to cover today. So first, I'm going to make an introduction that focuses mostly on Western traditions of warfare, philosophical traditions that we could describe as classical, both in terms of the views that they articulate, but also their histories. Then we're going to move to contemporary perspectives or contemporary theories of war. And here there is, an enormous collection. So I am going to focus on one text only in that lecture today. Third, we're going to tackle a concept of substantiation in relation to war. And then finally, look at a case study that illustrates of how that concept functions analytically and critically. Good. So, what is war? The question, what is war, has preoccupied political philosophers and theorists in the Western tradition and beyond that since antiquity. So one of the earliest definitions of war comes from the Roman philosopher Cicero, who offers us a very brief, but nevertheless still quite illuminating intervention. And Cicero defines war as, I quote, a contention that is carried on by force. So it might seem quite abstract, it might seem quite general, but notice that he's already defining for us an overlap of two areas of human activity, with the war falling in between them, right? Or at the overlap of them. One is contention, right? So conflict, strife, struggle. The other one is force, right? So exertion of power, specifically military power. So it's a particular type of conflict, if you like, a particular type of human struggle. And you will see as we move on, as we progress through this sort of scoping of different theories of war, that this will very much resonate with more contemporary thinkers as well, as they tackle the question of what war is. Another person you can see on the slide is a more contemporary thinker, though nevertheless a historical figure for us, early modern English philosopher from the 1600s, Thomas Hobbes. He offers us another highly influential definition of war in his main text, Leviathan, right? And what Thomas Hobbes suggests, which is a very sort of innovative intervention at the time, is that we shouldn't think about war as an event, right? An act or a phenomenon that sort of interrupts what is otherwise a peaceful neighborly coexistence between human communities. Thomas Hobbes suggests that war is a human condition, okay, or a state of affairs, if you like. So we could say, following him, that war is basically an expression of universal human predisposition that consists of a general willingness to fight one another, right? Unless something is put in place that will help us curb or harness that inbuilt aggressiveness, right? That inbuilt predisposition to fight one another. This is where, and you might be familiar with Hobbes from your other classes, this is where the state or state institutions come in, right? It's precisely the political institutions, the state, the sovereign, that helps us rein in human aggression and violence, right? So humans, for Hobbes, people relegate some of their powers, some of their freedom to the sovereign, to the institution of the state, as a way out of this condition of strife and violence, which inevitably would lead to destruction. So you might have read the Leviathan, or you might still in the future read the Leviathan in some of your other courses. But even if you haven't, you might be familiar with a phrase or a saying that is very closely associated with Hobbes, and that is of war of every man against every man. Pardon the gendered phraseology. This is meant to be an inclusive term, right? This is a defining characteristic for Hobbes of the state of nature or human life in the absence of governing central authority. And then a third person on your slide is an even more contemporary thinker to us today, a more contemporary scholar, one of the founding fathers of social theory and of the discipline of sociology, a German scholar, Max Weber, who lived in the 19th and then early 20th century. Even though Max Weber never explicitly theorized war, so whatever remarks he made about the nature of war were in relation to something else, right? So theorizing the state, for example, or science, right? This is where his most influential remarks about war are to be found. Weber, in his classical theory of the state, focuses on the relation between the institution of the state and violence, right? And that's when he says that the state monopolizes the legitimate use of violence within a territory it claims. Okay? Let me repeat that again, because it's a bit of a mouthful. The state, right, monopolizes or holds monopoly on the legitimate use of violence within its territory, right? It doesn't mean this is the only violent actor in the world politics, right? There is also non-state or quasi-state actors, but see, the condition is that it's a legitimate use of violence, right? State, a war, right, as associated with the legitimate use of force insofar as it relates to the territory over which it has sovereignty. And this is something that I would like all of you to remember as we move on and we discuss more contemporary notions of war in international law and international politics, right? Which is that Weber is one of the key thinkers that cluster together and connect very closely state violence and war. Right? More recently, that claim has come under scrutiny in those debates where scholars draw our attention to warfare, which is conducted by non-state actors or quasi-state actors, actors that are autonomous or semi-autonomous from state institutions. Okay. So we obviously won't take Weber at face value, but it's an important point of orientation even today. So even for those who want to critique or challenge that view. All right, so we've got four thinkers, right, from very different periods. Here is the fourth one, and we're going to stop for a little bit more with this particular scholar, with this particular theorist of state violence. His name is Karl von Clausewitz. So you might have heard about him before, or perhaps not. Karl von Clausewitz was only secondarily a thinker or a scholar. First of all, his first occupation was, he was a general in the Prussian army during the time of the Napoleonic Wars. Right? And then on the basis of the reflections on his experiences, right, also combined with the theoretical education he gained as a military theorist, he wrote during his lifetime after the wars a book which was published after he died called Vom Kriege, so On War. Okay? And this is a book that up until today becomes a kind of reference point for contemporary theory of warfare, including theory of world politics, right? So, or international politics, but also in other disciplines or in other scholarly debates. What is important to remember about the book is that it sort of has two aspects or two agendas. And in order to grapple with what is so innovative, what is so important about the way that Clausewitz describes modern warfare, we need to address both or be aware of both. The first one is that this isn't just a pure work of scholarship. This isn't a pure work of philosophy. Vom Kriege was meant as a treatise about political military analysis and strategy. Okay? So for Clausewitz, if you were a leader, if you were a military leader, you could read his work and actually wage a better warfare, right? If you implemented some of the theoretical principles or you learned from critical remarks that Clausewitz makes in relation to the Napoleonic War. And then the second aspect of it is that it is also a work of political theory and a work of international political theory. So why do I claim, and together with many others of the readers of, among many other readers of Clausewitz, that this is such a path-breaking text, right? Vom Kriege is the first book that we have in the Western canon, right, that presents armed conflict, war, as an expression of international norms, all right? So it is possible to build on this and actually create international legislation, right? Rules of international governance that will define what is legitimate and what is illegitimate in the conduct of war. Okay? For von Clausewitz, actually similarly to Hobbes, right? It is peace that is anomalous, right? War is the norm in international relations. In fact, famously, he says that peace is merely a breathing time, okay? That leaders, military leaders, political state leaders have that allows them to prepare for the war that is to come, okay? So you could say that this is a bit pessimistic view, right? But maybe that is too much of a normative judgment. We could say it's a realistic view of international politics, right? And in fact, if you were to classify von Clausewitz as a type of international thinker, we would call him a realist, right? This is very much a realist vision of what international relations are. War is this never-ending cycle in international politics. So Clausewitz wrote famously that to secure peace, in other words, to win war, right, to be victorious in war, is to gain an opportunity to prepare for war, right? Another point that I make and that you can see on your slides is that this text is considered among scholars of warfare in world politics as the first modern theory of war. Okay? So why is that? Why does it address or help us understand some kind of specificity about the modern war? Okay? It's because for Clausewitz, right? Or because Clausewitz identifies and theorizes, right, certain aspects of the Napoleonic Wars that he witnessed as a military leader, as one of the military leaders of Prussia, that have to do with what made Napoleonic Wars truly modern, right? And that is that these were what we call total warfares, right? This is something you might have known before, maybe from history classes, maybe still from high school. That's of course subject to debate, but or could be subject for debate, and you could question this. Often World War I has a status of the first total war, at least in the Western tradition again. But I would argue, or I would agree with those theorists of war who argue that it was actually the Napoleonic War that were first total warfare, or absolute warfare is another term, or real warfare. What does that mean? What theorists of war mean when they use the term total war is that this is a war that is waged in relation to the state's capacity to mobilize all of its sectors, its society, all of its infrastructures, right? Both the military infrastructure, obviously, but also the non-military aspects of its economy, of its production, right? Of its services, of its resources, of its administrative operations in the service of war. This is what is unique about Napoleonic War, but definitely is also a defining characteristics of the 20th and 21st century war. Clausewitz famously compares war to a duel, right? This is a bit of a simplistic metaphor, a simplistic comparison, but it also helps us grapple with his theory, with the theory of war that he offers. He says, war is a duel, or is like a duel, but on an extensive scale. This is a quote from On War. It's an act of violence intended to compel our opponent to fulfill our will. Okay, so you might say it's a bit of a simplistic understanding of war, or a simplistic definition of war, but what he's doing, he's breaking a massively complex phenomenon that modern war is into its constitutive bits and pieces, right? Its defining foundational elements. There are three such constitutive elementary aspects of war that we can derive from the definition. One is precisely the total war, which is that war demands an utmost use of force from those who wage it. Second, that war has as the goal disarming of the enemy. And third is that it demands an exertion of power. It's a power dynamic, right? An international power dynamic, a relational power dynamic. It is interesting that von Clausewitz's work has had sort of up and downs in terms of its public receptions, right? So right after its publication, it was enormously popular. Then its popularity declined, and then it waned, and then it sort of escalated again, both immediately after and during World War I, but especially that's going to be important for us because we are studying contemporary dynamics of international politics right after World War II, and then throughout the second half of the 20th century and 21st century. What made Clausewitz's notion of absolute war or total war so attractive for international political theorists in that time period is that he articulates an idea or makes a proposition that war and the conditions of modernity, right, under the conditions of modern state cannot be waged in a limited way, okay? It cannot be sort of sectorialized or compartmentalized, but in a sort of limited way, but it has this total dimension to it, right? And of course, World War I and World War II, in the history of European warfare, is precisely a demonstration of what a total war means. I have mentioned before that Clausewitz is claimed by the realist tradition in international politics, and here you can see why, right? What is realist about Clausewitz's insistence that the goal of war is basically successfully inflicting damage or destruction on the enemy, right? So the goal of war for Clausewitz, the real goal of war, or the primary goal of war, is not defense, is not prevention, right? Is not securing peace, as you would have in alternative traditions, right, that deal with war, like the liberal tradition. It is to win, right? Is to inflict sufficient damage, sufficient destruction on those who are the enemy. All right. The final thing I want to bring to your attention, because we are going to return to it in the second half of the lecture, it is something that has been quite important to the contemporary theorizing of warfare in world politics, is attention to warfare as a phenomenon that consists not only of material elements, but also of immaterial elements. So Clausewitz specifically writes about a whole of society, a whole of state being mobilized in the conduct of war from the perspective of emotional resources, or we could call them affective resources, right? At the level of affect. Clausewitz writes that one of the elements underlying the reality of war is the capacity of the state to generate hatred of the enemy. So this is very interesting, right? You could say that emotions, how people feel, is irrelevant, or maybe, or at least secondary, right? Wouldn't the military power, the military dominance be key? And Clausewitz, of course, he would be the last person to suggest that this is irrelevant. Obviously, the military dominance, the military challenge, material infrastructural challenge, is very important, as is the logistic and leadership aspects of war. But he nevertheless does not fail to recognize that the way a whole society feel about the context, right, about the cause, about the event itself, is going to be very crucial, especially in the long term, right? Napoleonic wars were long wars, right? As were the two major 20th century wars in Europe. And you could also argue that today we are witnessing wars that were the question of the duration of warfare, right? So-called wars of attrition are also long duration wars. So emotions matter in regard to collective state violence, right? Passions that people that live during peacetime, right, might be latent, especially in modern societies, right? Because that's part of kind of living in modern civilized societies, as von Clausewitz suggests, is that we have to repress and sublimate emotions such as hatred of the other, or aggression towards the other, or the desire to harm the other, right? Some kind of sadistic desires. In the time of war, they not only become unleashed, but they can be extremely helpful. They can be extremely productive, he says, in the mobilization of the whole of society in the service of war, right? Another way of thinking about it would be that war reveals something about human nature, right? About human propensity to violence and aggression that culture, that civilization, that modern society has suppressed. Have a look at that quote, okay? Clausewitz is very realistic in his depiction of the battlefield. That is another reason why we would think of that text as some people call it the first modern narrative of warfare, all right? He resists the temptation to idealize, to present a battlefield as somehow an exhilarating display of human strength, of, I don't know, masculine physical capacity, if you like, right? He's using a very contemporary language, or at least a language that we, in collective memory of war, tend to associate with narratives of World War I, right? It's a battlefield is a space where people experience shock, where they are severely traumatized, right? He says in book 1 that war is dangerous, frightening, physically and mentally taxing and painful. The quote that I give you on the slide, right, is a more lengthy narrative, very graphic depiction of the horror of the battle, right? So in book 1, he writes, and I quote, "A noise is heard that is a certain indication of increasing danger," right? So the so-called bellotonics, right? So the noises of the battle, very important for narratives of World War I, but as you see here, also for the Napoleonic War. The rattling of grape shot on roofs and on the ground. Cannonballs tear past, whizzing in all directions. The musket balls begin to whistle around us. A little farther, we reach the firing line, where the infantry endures the hammering for hours with incredible steadfastness. Okay? Humans almost like these machines, right? The air is filled with hissing bullets that sound like a sharp crack if they pass close to one's head. For a final shock, the sight of men being killed and mutilated moves our pounding hearts to awe and pity, right? So it's a very affective, emotional narrative, a grueling one as well, okay? A sight of horror and awe. So the final thing I want to mention is that Clausewitz, following from that, right, from this idea that the horror of the battlefield are traumatizing, but they also are somehow unleashing or helping its participants to get in touch with what modern society has repressed, okay? What people maybe have forgotten about themselves living in modern societies where, there is no space for violence. Violence is prohibited, physical violence is prohibited, right? Or it's channeled into institutionally legitimate actions. For example, the institution of the police. Clausewitz also writes a lot about the figure of the soldier, right? Given the liminal experience that war is, right, he suggests it takes an extraordinary physical and mental powers to be a soldier. Right? So you could, I did say it's a non-idealized depiction of a warfare, but perhaps you could push me on this and say that at the very least, Clausewitz has an idealized image of the figure of the soldier, right? And that includes, of course, those in position of leadership. And this is because for him, war is a kind of a situation that, it's a major sort of crisis, it's an extreme experience, but it's also an opportunity for people to get in touch with virtues. We could use them, we could call them, using a gendered language, masculine virtues, that modern citizens have lost, right? Strength, resilience, vision, bravery, collective spirit, right? These are all virtues that war demands of its participants, but that we have living in modern societies as civilians, if you like, we have lost. This is a quote from Fraser and Hutchings, right, from their book on violence and political theory, that articulate this aspect of Clausewitz very well. I quote, "There is a clear echo in von Kregen of Machiavelli," right? So Machiavelli was another thinker, another realist thinker, with a kind of a Machiavellian concern, I continue to quote, about the effeminacy and the corruption of the city, right? As opposed to what the military camp represents, right? The military camp represents, Fraser and Hutchings write, I quote, "an alternative to and a source of renewal for that corrupt city or corrupt society. Paradoxically, it is the soldier who embodies the virtues that citizens, modern citizens, have lost." All right. So quite a provocative, if you like, view. Here is a quote directly from Clausewitz that encapsulates this. This is from book 3, right? So far I've quoted from book 1. Clausewitz suggests, "Nothing else but war will counteract the softness and the desire for ease which depays the people in times of growing prosperity and increasing trade." This is also called the virtuous theory of war. So to sum it up, okay, I have spoken a lot about Clausewitz. Perhaps I have not, I have encouraged you to look at the primary text itself. I would very much hope I have not discouraged you. Let me sum it up by asking, how does this matter for us? Okay, so if we agree that what interests us, the sort of central preoccupation of this course, is with the political, with the international political or the world political, how does this conception of war relate to world political theory, right? Clausewitz, importantly, does not present war as somehow separate from politics, from world politics, as a kind of suspension of political rules or something in opposition to political spaces, right? Violence for him is not the opposite of politics. Politics isn't about consensus and deliberation. It is a space of legitimate violence as well. Right? War is not inimical, we could say, not hostile to politics. Right? It is, in fact, as he puts it in a famous definition of war, it's an expression of politics or continuation of politics by other means. You might have heard that definition before. It's quite well known, and perhaps you have heard it without knowing that the author of that saying, "War is continuation of politics by other means," is by Clausewitz. Right? War is an element of statecraft. So far we have moved through point 1, classical depictions of war, okay? Or classical perspectives of war. We have moved through 4 thinkers. The 3 we've just touched on briefly and then focused more on von Clausewitz, right? What I have tried to do so far is to bring to your attention elements which, while they might be quite historical, right? Those views, Clausewitz views, for example, are 200 years old. Okay, so we might think of them as perhaps a bit archaic. But you will see as I keep going through the class today on what war is in contemporary perspectives, the next class, which is on technology and war, and then the one after that as well on terrorism and violence or non-state violence in world politics, that these views are very much alive today. they animate our thinking, they keep provoking us, and there is something about them that captures also or gestures at our own experience and witnessing, our witnessing. It doesn't always have to be direct experience of state violence. So let me move to the second part of the lecture, and this is on contemporary take on the question of what is war, okay? Contemporary perspectives on war. There is a plurality of approaches and theories of war, and if this course was on war, we would be going through them one by one, right? I don't really take this as a kind of aim of the course to give you a comprehensive overview, but more to illustrate what kind of problems and what kind of concepts are brought to bear to analyze the phenomenon of war in world politics and to critique war, right? If you look at the extensive literature for that course, the subsection, What is War, will give you a lot of other texts that you could go to expand your knowledge, should that be something that you would like to deepen or pursue further. The text that I would like to thematize and foreground in the discussion of contemporary perspectives on warfare was written in 1980s, so it isn't very recent, but nevertheless, I count it as contemporary. I hope you will too, especially after you've heard me talk about this and what's so relevant about the text for us today. And that's a book by Elaine Scarry called The Body in Pain. This isn't a book about war itself, but it has one long and very influential chapter on war. The whole book I would classify as part political theory and part cultural criticism. So it brings those two together. What is interesting and innovative about Scarry's take is that she approaches war as a world political event, but she does it from the perspective of the body, okay? And more specifically, as you can realize just reading the title, from the perspective of bodily pain, physical, but also mental pain. So another way of putting it, right? This isn't book only about, I don't know, phenomenology of pain, or this isn't only cultural studies, but it's more that she takes the phenomenology of pain, right? Physical, but also mental experience in war as a kind of entry point or anchor for theorizing war as a world political event. All right, I hope this is clear. Scarry herself writes in the introduction to the book, right? This is a text that is available on Moodle for you. She notes the difficulty of expressing physical pain. This is a point you might be familiar with, right? So the difficulty of putting pain in language, describing pain, describing the experience of pain, putting it into words, right? And then she asks, what are the political complications that arise as a result of that difficulty? Through the bodily focus, she is able then to formulate a definition of war that is quite different from the ones I have outlined so far and that I have defined as classical, all right? And I would also suggest that she is uniquely perceptive. She grapples with the destructive power of war, and in some ways it might seem like she's repeating, if you like, the claim we have already encountered with Clausewitz, right? Which is that the goal of war is defeating and destroying your enemy. But she does it in corporeal terms, in literal terms, right? When Clausewitz says that the goal of war is to destroy the enemy, right? He isn't grappling with the physical, the material reality of bodily destruction, right? For Scary, this is a very literal take, right? She articulates a literal take. The goal of war, right, is to damage the human body and also the material objects, right, of those who are identified as enemies, who are my enemies in warfare. All right, so this is quite a simple slide, and I'll go through it quite quickly, and then the following slides will help deepen that one, this kind of graphic representation that you can see. So I opened the class saying that war is a contention carried on by force, right? This was a quotation from Cicero's definition of war. War is a human strife, human struggle that is carried on by violent means, in other words, right? And I have suggested that this locates war at the kind of overlap or intersection of two human activities. One is that of conflict, right? We have other conflicts. They don't necessarily need to be conducted or resolved through violent means. And the other one is violence. But there is also examples of violence that have nothing to do with contention, right? So it's the overlap of two. The war kind of falls at the interstices of those two in between. And Scary says something similar. So you can see that she's drawing, reworking, rearticulating those classical views as well as she's proposing her own, right? She calls it the interior fact of war, which is that in order to be classified as war, a phenomenon that you see, right, needs to fulfill two criteria. It is not enough to declare something war, okay? For her, first is violence, right? War is an activity of injuring or doing damage to the bodies of the enemy, right? As well as to material things, right? And it isn't only injury or damage, but it's a specific kind. So she calls it reciprocal injuring, right? So it isn't only me inflicting damage or injuring, but there needs to be a reciprocity. It doesn't need to be symmetry, right? And in fact, contemporary wars are hardly ever symmetrical, right? But there needs to be reciprocity. And this means, and I quote from page 63 of her book, is that the goal of war is to out-injure the opponent. Out-injure, it's a very, I don't know if you have ever, it's not a very common way of sort of constructing this verb, not simply to injure, but out-injure, injure more the opponent, okay? And then the other sphere of activity is contest. So contestation, this is what Cicero says, contest. War belongs, I'm going to repeat the same thing again, just to make sure it really sort of settles with you. War belongs to two larger categories of human experience, right? Violence and injury and contest. It bridges the domain of harm doing to the bodies and properties, right? And the domain of contestation, of competing almost, struggling for victory over your opponent. Let's look now more closely at two of each of these aspects or characteristics. So I said first that war is an injury, right? To call something war, it means to grapple with the materiality and experience and havoc that war is capable of wreaking. Let's look at that quote from The Body in Pain. Scary writes, the purpose of the event, right, a war, described so, is to alter, and she offers us these very material, right, these very concrete verbs, what altering as an abstract verb means. To burn, to blast, to shell, to cut. We could perhaps continue. Human tissue. as well as to alter the surface, shape, and deep entirety of the objects that human beings recognize as extensions of themselves. So this, you can think about the destruction of cultural heritage of cities during war, right? Of so-called civilian infrastructures, but of course also military infrastructure. Elsewhere in the book, she calls this this kind of another word she uses, which I think is very telling for that form of dual destruction of bodies and things, as the unmaking of the world, right? So what she's trying to grapple with, if you like, and something that perhaps we could indirectly detect in Clausewitz's work, but is very pronounced in the contemporary world political theory of war, is that war is not creative, right? War is a destructive event, and it's important to come to terms and think about what is the destructive, this undoing, this negative aspect of war, right? What war is, right? In other words, the answer to the question of this class, what is war, is via another question, which is, what does war do? And if you ask Scary, she would, she could give you this larger descriptive definition that I just cited. But if we pressed her for one word or one phrase, she would say, war unmakes, okay? What we have fabricated, what we have produced with our hands as human communities. It's the unmaking of human bodies, and it's the unmaking of material world, of buildings, cities, objects, whole civilizations, whole societies. Okay? So personally, I find this quite insightful. But you might also argue that this is actually quite obvious, right? She is just putting into a theoretical language what we observe, witness, and attend to, even just by following media accounts of war. But I would like us to recognize or think about the critical potential or critical import of this insight, right? And this is due to the fact that Scary recognizes that bodily injury is curiously missing, right, at micro discourses of war. So I'm not thinking about media representations, all right, at this time, which will often offer us images and narratives of war from the perspective of specific damages, specific injuries. I think that is actually something we see quite a lot. The problem maybe lies elsewhere, which is that there is a kind of competition of attention of injuries in media representations. But I mean more theoretical and technical security discourses, diplomatic discourses of war, military, tactical, and economic, right? So this is what we call micro discourses of war. She's sort of puzzled by the curious disappearance of the injured body in those accounts, in those discourses, in those languages, right? And so if you read the primary material, you will notice that she dedicates quite a large section of the chapter about war to this puzzle of invisibility or negligence of the injured body in the official discourses and theories of war. Her own response is dual, right? So the first thing is that war, the contemporary modern total war, requires infliction of damage and injury, but it also subsequently, I quote, requires disowning of that injury so that its attributes can be transferred elsewhere, as she puts it. Okay, let me read this again, just to make sure we understand that. Okay, war, we have already established this, requires infliction of injury and damage, but it also means disowning, right? Repudiating, disavowing, not claiming that injury, and then transferring attributes of that injury somewhere else. How are we to understand that? Where are those attributes transferred? By what means? to what end, right? With what goal in mind? One way of thinking about disowning the injury could be quite literal, right? It connotes that the interest of wanting to perpetuate war by the state agent, for example, but of course also quasi-state agents, right? There could be the interest of perpetuating war can vary and be plural, requires that the way the war is presented lowers the cost for the society, right? For the domestic population, right? So you can think about discursive tactics, right? Language tactics in which in different ways the number of casualties will be lowered or even denied, right? The releasing of numbers of casualties, of those who died, of those who were injured in the war, right, is itself something that attracts a lot of attention and a lot of controversy. And there is a lot of contestation and different ways of counting, right? You can sometimes have a conflict, of course, between the numbers that the state gives and then the international community and different NGOs and other states release. So these are discursive tactics, right? But there is, of course, also material tactics in which you will remove these bodies or at least remove them from public visibility. So just to give you one example from the war in Ukraine, an example that I think has attracted quite a lot of attention some time ago, it was the question whether the Russian aggressor was not trying to lower the count of the soldiers, right, that it mobilized through the use of mobile crematoria that were hiding casualties by burning bodies, right? So these are basically material and discursive examples of this disowning of injury that is closely tied to pro-war position, right? And then you can think about the contrast or reverse in which the anti-war position wants to, for a number of other sort of reasons, wants to make visible the injured bodies and the damaged objects. And so here we enter a different kind of discourse about modern war. And you can think about more historical examples from the 20th century, the anti-war coalition or the anti-war movement, and the way it used images of injured body from the war in Vietnam, right? From Hiroshima, from Dresden, right? And the bombings of Dresden to generate public support for the anti-war position, okay? And of course, you could probably give me numerous examples from contemporary media coverage of wars, Ukraine, Israel and Palestine, Syria, Yemen, of injured bodies, right? Of objects as well, of affected bodies in all sorts of ways that are sort of moved to the forefront and placed at the center of a vision, right? That tries to make a normative statement, right? Issue a normative judgment about the events at hand. So this is perhaps where we could finish, or we might be tempted to finish and think we have exhausted the question of what disowning the injury at war means, right? With or claiming the injury then for the anti-war position. But Elaine Scarry pushes us a bit farther, okay? She makes us think a little bit harder, if you like, about that question. And she says that the injured, the wounded real human body disappears from view because war is a collective activity, okay? And it demands a constant adjustment and readjustment of the scale, right? So the war, if you like, the narrative of the war, the narratives of the war, always plural, demand that we lift off, if you like, our gaze from the specific material body to what she calls the imaginary body of the collective, right? That sustains injury. This is a big topic. This is a difficult question, but I would be happy if you just sort of notice that, even if we are not able to exhaust that because of the limit of time. But think about how even the word body is used, right? It could be individual body, a material body, but in war, we also talk about what Scary calls the imaginary body, right? The nation as a body, the collective, an ethnic collective, a group, a national collective that sustains injury in warfare. If this is of interest, I recommend that you look more closely at the chapter on war in Scary's book, right? Because there is a kind of, I did mention that her own background is not in politics or in politics only, but in the study of rhetoric and the study of language, of political language. And she offers this detailed study of how the erasure of the body in war and its sort of extrapolation at the level of a collective imaginary body happens through different linguistic operations, right? So the way redescriptions or omissions, synonyms, metaphors, euphemisms, where you replace the signifiers of injury and you sort of sanitize it, right? So I will just mention this now without going too deeply to illustrate in case you're finding this quite abstract. Think about the language of accidental casualties, right? It's very often used in war, especially by the side that undertakes an act of military aggression, and there are civilian victims, okay? Not just military side, not just military personnel. The terminology that is used is accidental casualties. It's pivotal to representations of modern warfare and to justifications of violence, right? It connotes that to wound civilian infrastructure, to kill civilians, to harm physically civilians is not the goal of war, but as if it's byproduct, right? The wounding is not the goal. Think about other examples. The language of collateral damage, right? It's a euphemistic, metaphorical expression, but what collateral damage is basically the death and injury of civilians, right? But the language we use, state level, international legal level, is that kind of euphemistic metaphor. This is a quote from Scary, and then we're going to move on. Crucial to the analysis that follows is not the intricacy of the paths by which it, she means the injured body, the body injured in war, disappears, but the much simpler and more fundamental fact that injuring is in fact the central activity of war. Okay? Let this sink. And then she follows. Visible or invisible, omitted, included, altered in its inclusion, described or redescribed, injury is war's product, and it is its cost. It is the goal towards which all activity of war is directed, and the road to that goal. It is there in the smallest and folded corner of war's interior recesses, and still there where acts are extended out into the larger units of encounter. Okay? She doesn't make a distinction here between, she doesn't specify it's the injury of militants, right? Of militant bodies, of militant material infrastructural targets, right? There is a kind of, if you like, political honesty that she demands, that the wounding of civilians in modern warfare is also part of the war's design. Okay, moving on. We have about 15 minutes, so hopefully we'll get through that, and I still have your attention. But I know if you listen to it on the video, you can of course also stop and re-listen, make yourself a cup of tea if you like, have a little rest. So if you remember, I'm just going to show you this again. so that you know where we are in the lecture, I have shown you this graph, right, that places war at the overlap of injuring or violent human activities and then activities that have to do with contest. So we have looked at the first one. Let's look a little bit more closely at what it means to define war as contest. Okay, so I must say that in contemporary political theorizing, there is much more sort of audacity and interest in exploring this sort of injurious, damaging aspect of war than the contestation. And I think it's for a number of reasons, but just to mention one is that it almost seems inappropriate, right, to place war side by side of other activities that we would define as contest or contestation. It's almost like peacetime activities. It's almost like we are inappropriately comparing war, I don't know, to playful activities like sports and games, right, which are also contestations, forms of contestations. And so one thing I really like about Scary is that she moves against this inhibition, right? To place war side by side, things like games and sports. This is, of course, not to say that she equates them, right? She does differentiate them because the element of violence and force is a necessary sort of foundational element of war itself. But she nevertheless does not hesitate to see what happens if you juxtapose those different realms of human activity, right? She says that in war, one of the goals of war is to out-injure. Remember, I talked about reciprocal injury. Another word she uses is to outperform the opponent, right? This is also what is at stake in games and different sports, is you try to outperform the one against whom you act, or at least outperform those with whom you compete. Right? I did already mention, and I'm going to repeat again, that reciprocity does not mean that there is some kind of condition of symmetry of forces, right? In fact, I would have to struggle very hard to give you any example in which there is symmetry of warfare. Contemporary armed conflicts are highly asymmetrical conflicts. So what do we gain by juxtaposing war with other contest activities? Okay, like sports, like games. What is the contest structure of war, helping us understand about what war is? The contest structure of war for Scary has to do with something that she defines as self-canceling duality of war. Again, another difficult phrase, so let's unpack this. What is self-canceling duality? What is the duality of war, and why is it self-canceling? Okay, what is going on here? The duality aspect means that with the beginning of war, right, the contending parties enter into a kind of relationship which is dual in character, okay? With the self-canceling, we mean that this is temporary, which means that duality will come to an end with the end of war. Here, the input that Scary's work make into theory of world politics in regard to debates about war is quite apparent, right? So she describes war as a shift, and let me quote from the book, a shift from the condition of multiplicity, right, to the condition of the binary or duality in international relations, right? So if you think about a plurality of social agencies, a plurality of social international identities, right, in war, they solidify into what we might call sides, right? So what side do you take in that conflict? And you have two options, and perhaps you can also remain neutral, but you either for or against, either on the side of the friend or on the side of the enemy. It solidifies into two discrete identities, right? Are you the supporter or are you the antagonist? In war, many, plural, right, the multiple, many become too. And as Scary puts it really well, I think, until the end of war, this state of doubleness will reign, will be defining of those relationships. The friend and enemy distinction might be familiar. Again, something I will just mention here, and it's on your slides. I won't explore this further, but you might have in your courses in political theory encountered the name Carl Schmitt, right? Who argues that friend and enemy is a fundamental political category, okay? The fundamental category of the domain in the domain of politics. Just as when we talk about ethics, the fundamental category is good and evil. When we talk about aesthetics, right? It's ugly and beautiful. So these are kind of like normative judgment categories. With political categories, it is friend and enemy. Right? And then the self-canceling, so the kind of temporary character of war means that war itself will be, the end of the war will mean a transition from this condition of the binary, the dual, friend and enemy, to the condition of the unitary or multiple. So even though this is a relatively dated text, right? Text from the 80s, so about 40 years old, the book has seen something of a revival recently, and I have given you references to texts that try to use Scary's book to think productively about warfare in world politics, right? And beyond, critical studies of collective violence and war. The reason why people keep turning and returning to that book, I mean, there's many reasons, but one of its key insights, right? So this is going to be a bit of a summary here to bring it back, right? Like, what is the insight? What is the importance, the innovation of starting international theory of war in a counterintuitive moment of the space of the injured body, right? It seems counterintuitive. This isn't where we would normally start. And this is definitely not where thinkers like Hobbes or Clausewitz start, right? So what is the point of grappling with the materiality, with the physicality of body in pain, right? The claim that the injured body is fundamental to the logic of war comes hand in hand with critical perspectives from gender studies, from sexuality studies, from race and whiteness studies, and their perspective on war, right? This is I haven't really mentioned gender when I was talking about, but I didn't mention gender, I didn't mention sexuality, I didn't mention whiteness or race, right? So perhaps you have noticed that all of our thinkers before Scary were white males, right? So this kind of insight has been really picked up in different critical analysis that come from these angles. And with the last sort of 10 minutes that we have now, I would like to flesh out just one concept. So go even more deeply in this kind of theoretical critical thinking about war from the perspective of the body. And the concept you can see on your slides, it's a concept of substantiation, right? Perhaps you have heard that word before. Perhaps you have heard it used as a verb, which is more common, substantiate, which means to take something out and replace it with something else, okay? But not just a replacement, but a very specific kind of replacement. So something is insubstantial, something is perhaps immaterial, ephemeral, right? And to substantiate means to fill it with something more concrete, something more tangible, right? Something more substantial, as in the word. So to give you a more precise, more technical definition of what Scary has in mind when she uses and coins the term substantiation, as a kind of definition of the relationship between the body and violence in war is the way in which, in the domain of war, immaterial and textual, let's call them items, beliefs, ideas, ideals, values, become materialized, become embodied, become, she uses the word enfleshened, okay, are made into a flesh. She says, I quote, the damaged or altered or killed body in war functions as a vehicle for substantiation. Okay? This making material of ideas or ideals upon which war is fought, like the idea of the nation, right? The nation is an idea, or the people. It has a material aspect, you know, accumulation of bodies, but the people are an idea, a political idea, right? Through bodies and things at war, these ideas are made visible and they are made palpable, tangible. Okay? So the images I give you on this slide shows perhaps the clearest and most obvious examples, right? And that's the visual representation of the bodies of soldiers as a sort of embodiment of certain ideas, values, and virtues, right? Ideas such as patriotism, militarism, nationalism, right? These bodies enfleshen or embody them. One of the texts that I have suggested, secondary texts, and a kind of critical reading that uses this idea from Scarry, is by a feminist theorist of war, Leila Downey. Right? And she borrows from Scarry the concept of substantiation in her social critical analysis of images, first of all, of dead bodies in war. Okay? And her argument is that dead and wounded bodies functions, as she calls them, political technologies of war. Right? What this means is that bodies that are altered, right, violently altered through war, so dead or wounded, have a certain affective power. By this, I mean that when you look at them, even if there is a certain distance, so you don't encounter them in a kind of physical proximity, but you see them as images, they affect us. They make us feel. They might make us feel in particular way. They might try to direct or elicit, create certain emotions, but that is perhaps less relevant. But what emotions, what exactly are they trying to make us feel? It is more that it is very hard to respond to these bodies at a pure intellectual, rational level, okay? We also, we feel like those images exert certain force and they call for a response. For Scarry, this is because a kind of defining characteristics of any human body is this capacity that we all have, okay, for being damaged or wounded. She calls this woundedness. She calls it woundedness, but perhaps we could use a word that's more popularly used, and that's vulnerability or precarity, right? This sort of bodily vulnerability is a characteristics of all bodies, though of course it is also socially animated or socially mobilized, right? So some are more vulnerable than others, depending on all sorts of contexts. So this is an image that, if you remember, I have had a sensitive content alert for this course, and I do apologize if any of you find this image triggering. If we had an, in class, a personal discussion about this, I would very much like to have and hear your views, how you yourself might feel affected by that image, right? So this is an image of a civilian wounded body, and you might have seen it before. This image is about 2 years old, or a bit older than that, of a civilian from a Mariupol hospital from maternity ward who was wounded in an airstrike on March 9. So the name of the woman that you can see injured is Irina Kalinina, and she died shortly after, along with her baby, who was delivered by emergency cesarean, but did not survive. So you can see here, and perhaps you could reflect on your own, how does this image substantiate ideas at the level of bodily materiality, at the level of bodily vulnerability? And think about what emotions and it evokes, but also what message is embodied or unfleshed. To finish off, Downey continues. And this is almost a conclusion, so thanks for bearing with me. And I'm just going to give you one more illustration after that, and then I'm going to bring it to a close. So Downey continues, I quote, "If we take Scarry's assertion that wounding is central to war, insofar as it enfleshes," right? So again, this verb, "ideas through its power to affect the publics, we can assume that much of the work of war takes place outside or after the theater of fighting." Okay. This work of war, involves, for example, a process of attaching those broken bodies, images, materialities of broken bodies, and we could add also the material damage, right, to particular sets of ideas and staging encounters between those bodies and national publics. It requires that such political technologies are rooted in events and locations that might be often far away from the battlefield itself, right? That incorporates what she calls, and this is a really poignant phrase, the other spaces of war, right? Such as what we might consider the home front, spaces of civilian life, firmly within its machine. End of quote. So here we are back, right? We have circled back to a claim that Yuso made 200 years ago by Clausewitz, when he defines in what way is the modern warfare a total warfare, right? It doesn't mean that the fighting itself is going on everywhere, but that you have these different kinds of fronts, right? Ones that we might be tempted to define as immune from the battlefield, right? Defined by peace. Parts of civilian life, parts of civilian economy, for example, part of other cultural spaces that are being infused, mobilized, animated in relation to war, perhaps at the risk of simplification, at the service of war. And here is a final example that you will find, final example in this presentation, but you will find it better described in Downey's article itself, which is kind of a fascinating one. You might be familiar with this cultural phenomenon of the Invictus Games, or perhaps of Warrior Games. So the Invictus Games are in the UK context, and the Warrior Games are a bit older, and they are in the US context. It's basically sport contest, right? So these are competitive sport events, which are staged and that involved physically disabled representatives of that were formerly served in the military, right? It's an international event, but it's defined by this kind of larger framework of allied nations. So you wouldn't have, sportsmen or sportswomen participating and competing from nations that are defined as antagonists. And that's what makes it partly so interesting, right? And they were injured during active military service. The Invictus Games themselves were established by Prince Harry, so from the UK royal family, as the series of sporting events. And you will see at the final slide, I'm just going to shift there for a moment. I'm not going to play this, but if you click on that link, you have about 4 minutes promotional video. So it's incredibly positive about the games itself. I mean, I'm not trying to be negative about the game. I'm actually trying to be neither positive nor negative, but I just want to alert you to maybe think about them more critically through the prism of these concepts. So by all means, at the end of the lecture, feel free to listen to that promotional video, or you can stop the lecture now and listen to it and then come back for the final, literally 2 minutes left. Okay. So Downey uses Scary's concept of substantiation and the relationship between text, language, and body, materiality, right, in the act of bodily wounding and its significance for theories of war, to sort of study, analyze critically the Invictus Games, and shows how through these spectacles, through these competitive sporting performative spectacles, what is made visible to the national publics is part of this process in which support for the war, public consent, right, for the war is being processed and manufactured. I mean, she focuses specifically on the Afghanistan and Iraq war, but of course the Invictus Games continue, so there is a kind of plasticity about which war are we actually talking about. But historically, she focuses on Afghanistan and Iraq. You have these prosthetically modified and enhanced bodies that had been previously injured, right? So it's a kind of juxtaposition of wounded bodies of soldiers, but also of highly performing athletes, machine-like bodies. That, I quote from Downey, becomes a powerful site for the production of narratives, of military service, of sacrifice for the nation, but also brought together with discourses around, technical supremacy. Many of these bodies have prosthetics, right? You can see them featured in the video, but also of individual stories, right? Where they foreground vulnerability, trauma, but also stories of overcoming adversity through willpower, through recovery, through strength, through communal support, so friends and family, but also, of course, technicians and doctors and trainers feature as really important part of that. And what we are kind of called to feel, right, how we are called to respond affectively, it might involve sympathy. Sympathy is part of that as well, but it's also highly animating, right? It's supposed to hype people up, right? So we're not just meant to be sympathizers. We are meant to be involved. We are meant to be on board with their cause. We are meant to be convinced. We are meant to support. It's a kind of a showcase, right, of the wounded body as an athletic body. Good. So I think this is it. Let me bring it to a close. Okay. Hopefully, you have found this clear, and you have found it at some level compelling, and I haven't lost your attention or your interest. And just a reminder that even though you are listening to these lectures online, it doesn't mean that you need to be disconnected from a dialogue with me. And if there is anything that you would like to ask about the lecture, if there is anything you would like me to explain better, if there is anything you would like me to expand on, this is by all means possible. So you are always very welcome to contact me by email. And then a final reminder is that now that you have listened to that lecture, right, a reminder about how this course works, now please go to the specific tasks that you will find on Moodle that asks questions about this material, okay? And I will mark them as part of your credit for participation in the course. Thank you very much, and see you next time.